The North Atlantic, 1940. A vast stretch of freezing gray water that held the fate of an empire. Britain stood alone, surrounded by enemies, its cities burning under German bombs, its soldiers scattered across collapsing fronts. Yet the real battle for survival wasn't fought in the skies over London or on the fields of Europe. It was happening here, on the cold, endless ocean, where no headlines reached and no medals glittered. This was the War of the Convoys, ordinary merchant ships carrying food, fuel, and weapons, sailing from North America to Britain under constant threat of attack. They called it the lifeline, because if it was cut, Britain would fall. The Nazis knew it too. For Adolf Hitler, the Atlantic was more than water. It was the battlefield that could choke Britain into surrender without firing a single shot on land. Every voyage was a gamble with death. Beneath the surface, German U-boats prowled like wolves, silent, patient, and deadly. Their mission was simple: destroy everything that floated under the British flag. Convoys were organized in long columns, each vessel carrying the hopes of millions back home. But to the enemy, they were just targets in the dark. Imagine the scene: thick fog rolling across the ocean, the hum of diesel engines, and sudden chaos when a torpedo strikes. One explosion, and a ship vanishes into black water within minutes. There were no front lines here, no safe zones, only fear, courage, and the desperate will to reach home. What made this war so haunting was its invisibility. The people in London or Manchester heard news of battles, but not of the nameless sailors lost in the freezing Atlantic. There were no parades for them, no dramatic speeches, just quiet disappearance. And yet, these men were the reason Britain did not starve. As Winston Churchill later admitted, the Battle of the Atlantic was the only campaign that truly frightened him. He knew that if the convoys failed, the war was lost. And so, while bombs fell on Britain's cities, another war raged silently beneath the waves, a war that would decide not only Britain's survival, but the course of world history itself.
To understand why the Battle of the Atlantic was so critical, we have to look at Britain's situation in 1940. After the fall of France, the island nation was completely isolated. Nazi Germany controlled almost all of Western Europe, and the U-boats had taken over the North Sea. Britain had no direct access to supplies from the continent. Every loaf of bread, every tank, every bullet, and every drop of oil had to come across the ocean. Britain's strength had always rested on its navy and its trade routes. For centuries, the British Empire had relied on sea power to connect with its colonies and allies, but in World War II, this dependence became its greatest weakness. Hitler understood this perfectly. He didn't need to invade Britain with armies, he just needed to starve it into submission. If the supply lines across the Atlantic were severed, Britain would fall, without a single German soldier setting foot on British soil. The numbers alone tell the story. Britain imported nearly 2/3 of its food and raw materials. More than 60 million tons of cargo had to cross the Atlantic each year to keep the war effort alive. The Royal Navy had to protect over 1,000 merchant ships sailing each month. It was a monumental task, protecting slow, vulnerable convoys from invisible killers lurking below the surface. Each convoy was a symbol of defiance. They set out from ports in Canada and the United States, Halifax, New York, Boston, carrying wheat, oil, airplanes, trucks, medicine, and troops. Every ship had a purpose. Every crate mattered. The journey took weeks, through rough seas and storms, under the constant threat of attack. There were no guarantees they would arrive. Meanwhile, on the home front, the pressure was mounting. By late 1940, German submarines were sinking ships faster than Britain could replace them. The losses were staggering. Hundreds of ships gone, thousands of sailors lost. Food was rationed, fuel was scarce, and morale was fragile. Ordinary citizens began to realize that the war was no longer just about bombs and battlefields. It was about survival itself. Winston Churchill called the Atlantic the gateway to victory. He knew that without control of these waters, Britain's resistance would crumble. The factories that built Spitfires and tanks would stop running. The soldiers in North Africa and Europe would be stranded. Even the Royal Air Force would run out of fuel. The ocean was not just a route, it was the bloodstream of the nation.
As Britain clung to survival, another power was quietly gaining dominance beneath the waves. The German U-boat fleet, known as the Unterseeboote, became Hitler's most effective weapon in his quest to isolate the island nation. These submarines were small, cramped, and unforgiving machines, but in the hands of skilled commanders, they became predators capable of bringing empires to their knees. The man who shaped this strategy was Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German submarine arm. Dönitz believed that a coordinated attack by multiple U-boats, known as a wolf pack, could destroy any convoy that dared to cross the Atlantic. The idea was brutally simple. Once a single U-boat spotted a convoy, it shadowed it silently, sending encrypted radio messages to others nearby. Soon, half a dozen submarines would converge like hunters surrounding their prey. Then, under the cover of night, they would strike together. The tactics were devastatingly effective. In 1940 and 1941, U-boats sank thousands of tons of Allied shipping. Merchant ships disappeared almost daily. Survivors told stories of eerie nights when the sea was calm and quiet, until suddenly, explosions ripped through the dark. Ships went up in flames. Men leapt into the icy water. The screams, the smell of burning oil, and the silence that followed became the soundscape of the Atlantic. Still, even as the wolf packs closed in, Britain refused to surrender its lifeline. The convoys kept moving, the escorts kept fighting, and somewhere deep beneath the surface, a quiet race began between German innovation and British resilience. Behind every convoy number and ton of cargo were men. Ordinary sailors, fishermen, dock workers, and engineers, thrust into one of the most unforgiving environments in the world. They were not soldiers. Most had never seen battle before the war. Yet they found themselves in the middle of the Atlantic, steering ships through darkness, hunted by unseen enemies, and facing death not from bullets, but from cold, salt, and fear. These were the men of the merchant navy, and their story is one of courage rarely spoken of. They came from every corner of Britain and across the Commonwealth. Canadians, Indians, Norwegians, and West Indians. Some were barely out of school, others were old sea hands who had spent a lifetime on ships. But on the Atlantic, they shared the same fate. When the siren wailed and the captain shouted, "Torpedo port side," there was no time for panic, only instinct. Imagine their world. Aboard a merchant ship, life was harsh, even without the enemy. The steel decks were slick with ice. The winds cut through thick coats like knives. The noise of the engines never stopped, and the air below deck reeked of fuel, sweat, and metal. Sleep came in brief, uneasy moments. Every creak in the hull might mean a torpedo was coming. The men knew that if they were hit, they would have minutes, sometimes seconds, to escape before freezing water filled the ship. Survival in the Atlantic was brutal. When ships were sunk, lifeboats overturned in high waves, and rafts drifted for days with no food or warmth. Many froze before help could reach them.
Some convoys lost half their crews in a single night. Others vanished completely, swallowed by the cold, endless sea. And yet, despite the horror, thousands kept returning to the same deadly routes, not for medals or glory, but because they understood that without them, Britain would starve. On the escort ships, the Royal Navy and Royal Canadian Navy sailors lived under constant strain. They were the guardians of the convoys, men in small corvettes and destroyers fighting the unseen U-boats with depth charges and sheer determination. They often went weeks without rest, their ships tossed by storms and attacked in the night. The tension was unrelenting. One mistake could cost hundreds of lives. Letters from home became their only comfort. They read them by dim lights, with frozen fingers, as waves slammed against the hull. Some wrote back, though few letters made it before the next mission called. Families waited months for news that often never came. This was the unseen face of the Atlantic War, a human struggle of endurance, loyalty, and sacrifice. While generals planned strategies and leaders gave speeches, these men fought quietly, without recognition. Their courage kept Britain alive, one ship at a time. By 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic had become a struggle of minds as much as machines. The ocean was vast, but knowledge, information, was the weapon that could turn the tide. While sailors risked their lives at sea, another group of men and women fought a silent, invisible war from land. The scientists, engineers, and code-breakers who worked to outthink the U-boats. The most famous of these secret warriors were the code-breakers at Bletchley Park, a quiet mansion in the English countryside that hid one of the greatest intelligence operations in history. Inside its cold, crowded huts, mathematicians and linguists worked tirelessly to crack the German Navy's Enigma code. This machine encrypted every U-boat message, making their movements impossible to track. If Britain could break Enigma, it could see through the fog of war, and perhaps save thousands of lives. Led by brilliant minds like Alan Turing, the team at Bletchley eventually succeeded. They built machines capable of decoding German signals faster than anyone had thought possible. Each time a U-boat transmitted its position or received orders, the Allies began to listen. They called this secret intelligence Ultra. It was so classified that only a handful of people in Britain even knew it existed. But Ultra gave the convoys something they had never had before: forewarning. Meanwhile, technology at sea was advancing quickly. Early British sonar, known as ASDIC, evolved into a more powerful detection system that could locate submarines by sound waves. Radar was installed on ships and aircraft, allowing escorts to spot enemy vessels even at night or in fog. Depth charges, which once exploded blindly, were now dropped with precision thanks to new calculations and sonar readings. The Royal Air Force's Coastal Command also joined the fight, sending long-range aircraft to patrol the Atlantic. For the first time, U-boats found themselves hunted from above. Spotter planes could see the faint shadow of a submarine just below the surface, giving convoys a chance to escape before the attack came. But progress was paid for in blood. Every new piece of equipment, every decrypted message came after losses and trial. The scientists at home and the sailors at sea worked as one. Each breakthrough meaning another convoy might survive the journey. Still, the Germans adapted. They changed their codes, improved their torpedoes, and learned to avoid detection. The war in the Atlantic was becoming a race between invention and destruction. Every time one side advanced, the other answered. Yet with each passing month, the Allies were learning.
They began to fight smarter, not just harder. The ocean was still deadly, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of control. The silence was breaking, and Britain could finally begin to hear the enemy moving beneath the waves.
By 1941, the Atlantic had become the most dangerous battlefield on Earth. The German U-boats were winning. Britain's merchant fleet was shrinking. Supplies were running low, and morale was slipping. But history was about to shift. From despair came determination, and from isolation came strength. The years 1941 to 1943 would transform the tide of war through strategy, innovation, and sacrifice. The first turning point came with America's entry into the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Until then, the United States had supplied Britain through the Lend-Lease program. But now, America became a full combatant. With its vast industrial power and shipbuilding capacity, the Allied convoy system grew stronger almost overnight. New ships, new escort vessels, and more aircraft began to flood into the Atlantic. What had once been a desperate struggle for survival became an organized, coordinated effort between nations. Yet, even with American strength, the danger remained immense. The U-boats adapted quickly, expanding their reach from the North Atlantic to the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. They struck close to the American coast, sinking tankers within sight of the shore. For months, flames from burning ships lit up the night sky along the eastern seaboard. The Second Happy Time, as German sailors called it, saw Allied losses climb again. But the Allies learned. They began to implement new escort groups, teams of warships permanently assigned to protect convoys. Each group operated with practiced precision. Destroyers, corvettes, and frigates working together to spot and hunt U-boats. No longer were merchant ships left to fend for themselves. The convoys became living, moving fortresses. The introduction of long-range aircraft, such as the B-24 Liberator, changed everything. For the first time, Allied air patrols could cover the entire Atlantic, closing what had been known as the Black Gap, an area previously unreachable by air. This meant that U-boats could no longer attack in safety. The hunter was becoming the hunted. Technology also continued to improve. HFDUF, high-frequency direction finding, equipment allowed escorts to locate U-boats by tracing their radio transmissions. Combined with radar and sonar, this made it increasingly dangerous for German submarines to communicate or surface. By mid-1943, the results were clear. In just a few months, U-boat losses skyrocketed. Convoys that had once been slaughtered now arrived safely. The tables had turned. Admiral Donitz, the mastermind behind the Wolfpacks, was forced to withdraw many of his submarines, admitting the Battle of the Atlantic had reached a crisis for Germany. For the first time since the war began, Britain could breathe. Supplies were arriving. Factories were running. The nation that had been one torpedo away from collapse was now back on its feet. But victory had not come cheaply. Thousands of ships and tens of thousands of men lay beneath the waves, a silent graveyard stretching from Newfoundland to Ireland. The Atlantic had taken its toll, but Britain had survived the storm. Even after the turning point, the Atlantic remained a place of chaos and courage. The ocean never gave mercy, and neither did the enemy. Between 1941 and 1943, some of the most ferocious convoy battles in history took place, fights that defined the human spirit in the face of impossible odds. These were not simple naval encounters. They were nights of survival, fear, and unbreakable will. One of the most haunting was Convoy HX-229 and SC-122,
a double convoy attack in March 1943. More than 100 merchant ships sailed from North America toward Britain, escorted by a handful of destroyers and corvettes. Waiting for them, spread out across the cold North Atlantic, were over 40 U-boats, an entire wolf pack. The battle that followed raged for nearly a week. In the darkness, the U-boats struck in waves. Torpedoes slashed through the water, explosions lit up the night sky, and ships burst into flames. Radio silence ruled. No distress calls, no cries for help, only the chilling roar of the wind and the sound of ships breaking apart. Men jumped into the freezing water, knowing they might last only minutes before the cold took them. Eyewitnesses later described the scene as hell on the sea. The escorts fought desperately, dropping depth charges that shook the ocean floor. Some U-boats were destroyed, but the price was unbearable. 21 Allied ships went down. Cargo worth millions was lost, along with hundreds of lives. It was one of the darkest weeks of the war at sea. But these brutal battles were also turning points. Every tragedy taught the Allies how to fight smarter. Convoy tactics were refined, formations tightened, communication improved. Radar and sonar teams worked in perfect rhythm. The Royal Navy's escort commanders began to coordinate attacks like hunters themselves, no longer reacting, but predicting. The convoy system was evolving into a weapon. Beyond the numbers, these battles told the story of endurance. Crews who had lost everything, their ships, their friends, even their hope, returned to sea again and again. Some survivors said they didn't know why they kept going, except that quitting wasn't an option. They understood something few did, that victory on land and air meant nothing without the lifeline that flowed through the Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't one single clash. It was thousands of small struggles fought in silence and storms. Each ship that reached port was a triumph. Each man who returned a hero, even if history never remembered his name. As spring 1943 ended, the tide was finally shifting. U-boats began to fall faster than Germany could replace them. Convoys were arriving safely in record numbers. But the ocean still demanded its price. For every victory, there was loss. And for every ship that made it home, another vanished beneath the waves. The Atlantic remained cold, dark, and merciless. But through courage, cooperation, and sheer human will, Britain's lifeline held strong.
Every victory in the Atlantic came at a cost that could never be fully measured. Behind the statistics of ships sunk and convoys saved were the lives of tens of thousands of men who never returned. The ocean became their grave, silent and eternal, stretching from Newfoundland to the Irish coast. The Battle of the Atlantic was not only a story of strategy and technology, it was a story of sacrifice. By the end of the war, over 3,500 merchant ships and 175 Allied warships had been lost. Nearly 40,000 sailors from the Merchant Navy and 30,000 naval personnel had perished. Most were buried not in marked graves, but beneath waves that swallowed them without ceremony. The Atlantic, for many families, became a name whispered in mourning. Mothers, wives, and children waited for ships that would never dock, letters that would never come. The life of a convoy sailor was one of constant exhaustion and fear. The sea offered no comfort, only survival. Frostbite, hunger, and sleepless nights were normal. Ships rolled violently in storms, decks coated in ice that had to be hacked away to keep the vessel from capsizing. Men worked until their hands bled, then worked more. They saw friends vanish into black water, heard explosions that shook their bones, and yet the next morning they were expected to stand watch again. On shore, few understood their suffering. The newspapers wrote of heroic pilots, tank divisions, and generals. The convoy sailors received little fame, no headlines, no victory parades. They were the invisible warriors who fed a nation under siege.
Even Churchill later said that it was to the merchant navy that Britain owed the greatest debt. But the price of survival wasn't only paid in lives, it was also paid in spirit. The fear of the ocean left deep scars. Survivors often spoke of the nightmares that followed them for decades. The sound of engines, the smell of burning oil, or the crack of thunder could bring memories rushing back. Some found it impossible to return to sea. Others could never speak of what they had witnessed. And yet, without their sacrifice, the war would have been lost. Every ship that reached Britain carried hope, food for children, fuel for factories, weapons for soldiers, and faith that the island could endure. Each arrival meant life.
By mid-1943, the tides of war in the Atlantic had finally turned. After nearly 4 years of relentless struggle, the Allies had gained control of the ocean. Convoys that once sailed in fear now moved with growing confidence. The hunters had become the hunted. The turning of the tide was not sudden, but it was decisive, the result of intelligence, innovation, and endurance on a scale the world had never seen before. The introduction of escort carriers played a key role in this transformation. These small aircraft carriers accompanied convoys across the Atlantic, bringing with them planes that could spot U-boats from miles away. No longer were submarines safe beneath the waves or hidden by the horizon. Once detected, they faced swift retribution from depth charges, bombs, or gunfire. For the first time, the ocean itself seemed to be turning against them. The Allies also perfected their use of technology. Radar now operated at longer ranges and finer precision, able to track even the faintest signal of a submarine's periscope. Sonar, huff-duff, and coordinated air-sea patrols created a network of detection that closed every escape route. The German U-boat captains, once confident, daring, and deadly, found themselves trapped in an invisible web. On the intelligence front, Bletchley Park's ultra-decrypts continued to guide the Allies with remarkable accuracy. German communications were read almost in real time. Convoys were rerouted around danger zones, and hunter-killer groups were sent directly to ambush U-boats. What had once been an unseen terror was now a predictable, trackable threat. By early 1944, the tables had fully turned. U-boats were sinking faster than Germany could build them. The losses became unbearable, sometimes a dozen submarines destroyed in a single week. Admiral Dönitz himself admitted that the situation was hopeless. "He have lost the Battle of the Atlantic," he confided, though he dared not say it publicly. For the men at sea, victory was not triumph, it was relief. There were no cheering crowds, no fireworks, just the quiet realization that for once they might live to see home. The convoys began arriving in record numbers, carrying the tanks, ammunition, and food that would fuel the Allied invasions of Europe. Without those supplies, D-Day could never have happened. The success on the beaches of Normandy was built upon victory in the Atlantic. Yet, even in triumph, the ocean reminded all of its price. The waves still carried wreckage. The seabed still held the bodies of thousands who had not lived to see this day. Every calm horizon was haunted by memory. When Churchill finally declared that the Battle of the Atlantic has been won, it was not with celebration, but with respect. He knew the cost. He knew that Britain's survival and the liberation of Europe had been bought by the courage of those who fought a war without borders, under a sky without mercy. Victory at sea had been achieved, but it was written in saltwater, steel, and sacrifice. The legacy of the secret war. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the Atlantic lay calm once more. The convoys no longer carried fear, but peace,
bringing home soldiers, supplies, and the quiet promise of a rebuilt world. The war at sea had ended, but its legacy would live on in every harbor, every shipyard, and every family that had waited for someone who never returned. The Battle of the Atlantic was more than a military campaign. It was the heartbeat of Britain's survival. Without those convoys, no amount of bravery on land or in the air could have saved the island. Every loaf of bread, every gallon of fuel, every bullet and bandage that reached British shores carried with it the courage of the men who faced the ocean. They were the lifeline that kept a nation alive. In the years that followed, recognition came slowly. The merchant sailors had no medals waiting for them when they stepped ashore. Many simply returned to quiet lives, carrying memories too heavy to share. But historians and veterans alike began to understand the truth, that their struggle had been as vital as any battle fought on land. Winston Churchill himself called it the dominating factor throughout the war. He confessed that the U-boat threat had frightened him more than any other danger. It wasn't a single glorious victory that won the Atlantic, it was endurance. The patience to sail through storms, the courage to face the unseen, the faith to believe that one ship's survival could mean the survival of millions. Even today, the ocean keeps its secrets. Beneath its cold surface lie the wrecks of thousands of ships, silent memorials to the men who gave their lives so others could live. Each hull, resting on the seabed, tells a story of hope and loss, of fear and resolve. They are the forgotten chapters of a war that shaped the modern world. The technology, coordination, and intelligence systems built during this campaign laid the foundation for modern naval warfare and global cooperation. It proved that information could be as powerful as weapons, and unity could overcome even the darkest threats. But beyond strategy and machines, the legacy of the secret convoy is human. It is the proof that courage often lives in silence, that heroes can exist far from the front lines, on decks swept by rain, in cramped radio rooms, in freezing waters under a starless sky. As the waves continue to roll across the North Atlantic, they carry whispers of that invisible war, of men who faced the deep, not for conquest, but for survival. And though their names may fade, their legacy endures, in every ship that sails free, in every nation that stands because they once refused to sink. The secret convoys of the Atlantic didn't just save Britain, they saved the free world.